Now this video is unscripted and it's likely to be quite long as well, so if you don't like long YouTube videos then please tune away now. I'm making this video not as a response exactly, but thanks to the inspiration of the Ringway Manchester YouTube channel. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Lewis, who runs that channel, has made a number of videos about scanning in the last couple of years, and another one in the last few days towards the end of June 2022. Everything on his channel is definitely worth a watch, so I would recommend having a look. And that's GB3MH, the amateur radio repeater at Turner's Hill in the north of Sussex. This video is not going to be about what's legal and what's not. I'm not going to get into a discussion about that, what is legal versus what should be legal versus what the law means versus what the law says versus what the law ought to say, all of that stuff. The key word is discretion, both in terms of the fact that you are a scanner listener at all, and also in terms of telling other people. I wouldn't personally use a discone for three reasons. The first one is that it's a jack of all trades and master of none. On any given frequency you are not likely to get particularly good results. The second reason is that if you have it outside on your chimney after a year or two, or maybe even less, and the great British weather doing its worst, the discone will start to disintegrate, normally by the vertical rods starting to fall off. And perhaps the most important reason from a discretion point of view is that a discone can only really be used for one thing, and nothing screams to passing members of the public a scanner user lives here more than having a discone on the roof. My personal experience is that using a 2 metre 70cm collinear usually provides quite good results for general listening at VHF and UHF. I'm not alone in that. The late and much lamented Bill Robertson, who died 3-4 years ago now, used to write articles for Shortwave magazine and Radio User, and that was his experience as well. Now, my white stick antenna is actually inside my attic, mainly because I'm not good at clambering on roofs and putting antennas on the chimney, that kind of thing. Doubtless an antenna outside would work better. The one that I've got in the attic is affected by the roof tiles at VHF and UHF, mainly at UHF. Can't say by how much because I've never had the equivalent antenna outside to compare it to, but having it inside might not be the massive disadvantage that it first seems. That antenna is in as good a condition today as it was when I installed it in the loft 5-6 years ago. If that antenna had been outside for those 5-6 years, being shaken about in some of the strong winds we've had in the last couple of years, with rain pouring onto it, it's possible that it could be performing worse now outside than what I've got in reality, which is sheltered obviously by virtue of being indoors. So a bit of a trade-off there possibly. The way I mounted it, incidentally, because I'm not good with DIY and knocking nails into walls and things, is I got a rake, I then got a box and filled it full of heavy items, sat that box on the teeth of the rake so the handle was then vertical, attached the bottom of the white stick to the top of the handle, and the very top of the white stick then rests against the apex of the house. And when conditions have been good at VHF on the 2 metre band, I have managed to contact stations in the Republic of Ireland, France, Germany, Spain, Use the shortest run of coax that you can and make it as thick as you can. At VHF and UHF particularly, the losses will be quite high, so it's no good having a really good externally mounted antenna if you're then going to feed it with a long run of cheap and nasty and wafer thin coaxial cable. Latterly I've been using the Uniden UBC 125 XLT that you can see in front of me. I'm powering that from two AA batteries. Rechargeable batteries, which are nominally 1.2 volts, work as well as primary cells, things like Duracell and that kind of thing, that are nominally 1.5 volts. And indeed every scanner I've ever used has run quite happily from rechargeable batteries. I would certainly recommend using rechargeables these days. Any scanner will pull a fair amount of current, and if you use primary cells, particularly decent alkaline ones, it will cost a lot and you will be replacing them very regularly. And also, if you do, going off topic slightly here, if you do use non-rechargeable cells in your scanner or anything else, don't let them go flat and then just leave them in there. Any battery is capable of leaking. A flat battery, and particularly a cheap and nasty one from a pound shop, is almost guaranteed to start leaking pretty much as soon as it goes flat. If they leak, the electrolyte and the fumes from it are horribly corrosive and can cause irreparable damage to the device itself within, I was going to say months, but probably weeks or days. And the other piece of advice is don't use a mains adapter, a switch mode power supply to power your scanner. Even the best will generate a certain amount of noise that you don't want, and if it's a very cheap and nasty power supply, the amount of interference that it kicks out could make your scanner almost unusable. Make sure nothing is switched on in your house that's going to cause interference. Obviously other people's houses are beyond your control, but to give you an example, I noticed occasionally that I was getting a bit more interference on 2 meter channels than was the case previously. Not to the point that I couldn't hear what was on those channels, but it was enough to knock out the weakest of signals that were coming in. And it was only after I'd heard this interference 2 or 3 times that the penny suddenly dropped that it always happened at the same time that I was using a particular battery charger. So needless to say, if I'm scanning now, I make sure that particular battery charger isn't switched on. I've had scanners for years and years and years, but I never really used them to any extent until March 2020 came round, and due to lockdown I found myself working from home for 5 days a week. Scan different times and different days, so if like me you have your scanner on in the background when you're at work, you're probably going to be listening weekdays in the mornings and the afternoons. If that's you, then try occasionally listening in the evenings or listening at weekends instead. Also, let that inform the frequencies that you scan. If you are only going to be near your scanner for half an hour at a time, you might want to choose a few frequencies, say, I don't know, 3-5 megahertz or something, and scan those. The advantage of that is that it will take your scanner less time to go around the loop. The disadvantage is that you're only concentrating on that bit of bandwidth, and something really interesting could pop up on a different frequency outside of those you're listening to, and you'll end up missing it. If you're going to be, say, working from home for 8 hours, then you might do better to scan the entire VHF and UHF ranges. That's what I tend to do, and anecdotally, and of course your mileage may vary, but anecdotally I would say I have picked up more things more often doing it that way than I have done just by scanning a few megahertz of frequencies at a time. Now, if you're scanning what you've got stored in your memories rather than scanning the frequencies, if you're analog only, like I am, don't discard a frequency because it's suddenly got DMR on it or digital on it. Even then, it is still possible that analog transmissions could occur from time to time. For example, on the Shopwatch system in a town near here, they had a transition period when they went from fully FM to fully digital, and during those couple of years they were mostly digital, but occasionally the whole system would flip over to FM if a shop transmitted in FM. And what I think was happening was, if new shops joined, or if a new shop opened that was, say, a small independent business rather than a supermarket or something like that, who maybe couldn't afford a digital radio initially, I think what they were doing was giving them one of the older FM radios, and then whenever that shop transmitted, it would flip the whole system onto FM. So that's probably going to happen less and less as time goes on, but even so, don't discard a frequency altogether just because you are hearing mostly DMR traffic on it. There could still be some analog traffic as well. And on that note, old frequencies that have been quiet for a long time can suddenly be reactivated out of the blue. To use Shopwatch again as an example, in a different village not far from me, there was a Shopwatch system that just went off the air 10-15 years ago, a long time, and I assumed that that was it and that nothing would ever be heard ever again. In the last couple of years, that town has had quite a bit of money spent on it. The pavements have been redone, the roads have been re-tarmacked, and a few months back I suddenly realised that there was an analogue transmission on this old Shopwatch frequency mentioning names of pubs and businesses, so I knew it was the same town, and Shopwatch was up and running again, and I can only assume that that was part of this spending that had taken place in the last few years. Even if that doesn't happen, old frequencies can be reactivated by other users. For example, there is a frequency that was used by a supermarket locally up until maybe 10 years ago. There was then many years of silence, but now in the last year or so there are other transmissions on there. If you've got a scanner with lots of frequencies in the memory, unless the memory is almost full and you need to delete old frequencies to make way for new ones, it's definitely worth leaving them in there, because you never know when, completely out of the blue, any of those frequencies could suddenly spring back to life. And I actually had an example of that in the last week. Again, without mentioning frequencies specifically, there is a VHF frequency that I've got stored in there where I haven't heard anything on it for, well, probably a year, if not longer. Last week I caught two very brief transmissions. They were quite strong, and they sounded interesting, shall we say, and let's say no more than that. Signals can travel a lot further than people think that they will. Okay, most handheld radios will be 5 watts maximum, but if you're listening to somebody who's happens to be standing quite on ground quite a few feet above sea level, or on a hill, then that signal can travel a lot further than you would ever give it credit for. From here, I'm in a semi-rural area. I have heard communications from events. That's 2 meter simplex frequency, somebody on there in the distance. I have heard comms from events, and I have no idea. I think I'll lock that one out temporarily in a minute. I have no idea what they are and where they are. I'm too far out in the sticks for it to be anything within a mile or two, in all likelihood. So signals can and do travel a lot further than you think they're going to. It's worth listening, especially if there are events on locally to you. And you might think, well, yeah, if there are events, everybody there will be using DMR. Well, a lot or most of the people there might be, and it might well be encrypted at that. But it's always possible you'll have people there who aren't. So, for example, if you have an overnight walk for a hospice, which seems to be quite popular at this time of year, the organisers in the base, in the control centre, may be using DMR handhelds. The medical vans going round may be using DMR handhelds. But the marshals, particularly if they're volunteers, may be using amateur frequencies or possibly even CB frequencies. There was a 4x4 group locally that used communications on CB, and they were on channel 16. A local neighbourhood watch group used to have their vans going round at certain charity events, and they were on the UK simple light channels, or whatever they're called. Whether they still are, I don't know, but I know there was a time when they were the only analogue radio traffic at a particular event, them and the guys using 4x4 on 2 metre frequencies and CB. The other thing that can happen is that equipment that's been decommissioned can turn up. Many years ago now, when the emergency services, police, fire, ambulance went from analogue to tetra, there was a lot of old equipment that will have been scrapped. Without going into the details, I personally know somebody who was working on the communication side of a blue light service, who was involved in decommissioning a radio system, and there was a repeater unit that by rights should have been thrown in the skip. That was saved, and very occasionally these days you'll hear it on the air. There's a group of people who just use it for the hell of it, for the fun, or for staying in touch when they're out and about, illegally and very, very naughty, obviously, but I'm not going to say that's a common occurrence, but it's not beyond the bounds of possibility. You know, you can scan a frequency 1,000 times and hear nothing, and then on the 1,001st time you can scan it and hear something very, very interesting. There could be lots of obsolete decommissioned units still in circulation. I suppose even after all these years it's possible that there are still some units switched on and in service somewhere, but that are just never routinely used, but are sitting there sort of humming away just in case anything happened, like if there was a major national emergency or something like that, and they could be sitting there ready and waiting to kick back into life. On that note, it's possibly worth buying an old scanner book, and an older one rather than a more recent one. The Scanners 4 book, I can't get it in the camera, hang on, there we are. That's Scanners 4. I bought that at a car boot sale for 25p last year, and although Scanners 7 is the latest version and probably the last after Bill Robertson sadly passed away, nevertheless the frequencies that appear in this edition that don't appear in the later editions can be quite interesting. If there's a tropospheric lift, so for example if you can hear radio stations on the FM broadcast band that you can't normally hear, or 2 metre repeaters that you can't normally hear, that's a sign that there's good conditions potentially, so it definitely might be worth having a listen then. In case you can hear things from further afield, there are a few frequencies that I've got programmed in here that I will only ever hear traffic on them, sometimes from France actually, if there are lift conditions. Talking about the amateur bands, if you're licensed to transmit, if you're using a white stick or a disc cone, then if it's been up on your chimney for a few years and you think that maybe it's not performing as well as it once did, water might have got in the coax, for example. If you transmit on 145 and 433 megahertz occasionally, if your nice low SWR has suddenly shot right up, then that's a surefire example that that things are perhaps not quite as good as they used to be. Okay, I hope these tips are useful. If you've got any thoughts or additional advice, then please do feel free to pop them in the comments. And enjoy scanning with your analog scanner. Yes, it is true that if you were listening years ago and you listened to the police and the emergency services and mobile phones and all this, then yes, it's true there is very little to listen to these days compared to then. But these days, finding new frequencies and trying to work out what they are and where they are, I think is good fun. It's almost like looking for a needle in a haystack, and I like the challenge of that. If I were to buy a digital scanner, I suspect that the vast majority of the unencrypted digital stuff would be things that I wouldn't be particularly interested in listening to, even if they were in analog FM. As I understand it, if you have a digital DMR radio, you can encrypt your transmissions just by ticking a box in the programming software. You don't have to buy extra units or extra expensive radios. You can just switch it on, as simple as ticking a box in some software. So common sense tells me that if you're running an operation where your transmissions are likely to be more interesting than most, then chances are you're going to turn the encryption on. So yes, I'm possibly missing out by not having a digital scanner, but maybe not as much as you might think, for the reason that that I've just said. And if I was really desperate to listen to that, I think there are ways using software-defined radios and freeware, and I haven't tried that because I'm nowhere near computer literate enough. So if I was really desperate to hear what was out there, I would sit down and study that and work out how to do it. If you hear a frequency with DMR on it, it's worth listening to. There's one frequency locally, and again, I'm not going to mention what it is. Out of every 10 transmissions, 8 are in DMR, the 9th one is in Analogue FM with voice inversion, and the 10th one is in clear FM. And the 1 out of 10 transmissions that are in clear FM are interesting enough for me to keep the frequency in the memory. So I hope this has been of interest. Apologies it's quite long, and enjoy your scanning, but as I say, for goodness sake, if you're going to do it, be discreet. So I would suggest that involves doing it at home rather than in public, and secondly, not telling people you're doing it. Have fun and stay safe.